The setting sun cast long shadows across Whispering Pines Cemetery as Katherine Morgan collapsed beside the cracked tombstone, her tears falling onto the dry Texas soil that had claimed her father just 3 days ago. Her slender fingers traced the jagged line that split the modest marble marker, a final insult from a world that had already taken too much. She didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats or notice the tall figure dismounting nearby. It wasn't until the shadow fell across her that Katherine looked up, hastily wiping tears from her dirt-smudged face. Caleb Hollister stood respectfully at a distance, his weathered Stetson already removed and held against his chest. His sun-bronzed face remained impassive, but his eyes, deep blue like the Texas sky at dusk, reflected a quiet understanding. Without a word, he lowered himself to sit cross-legged on the ground several feet away, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the sun was making its final descent. Katherine stiffened, suddenly aware of her vulnerable state. "I don't need company, sir," she said, her voice cracking despite her attempt at firmness. The cowboy nodded but didn't move. "Madam, sometimes the dead deserve more than one person to remember them." His voice was low and gentle, like distant thunder without the threat of storm. "You didn't know my father," Katherine replied, brushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. "No, madam, I didn't have that honor." Caleb's calloused fingers turned his hat slowly. "But I know what it's like to sit alone at a grave." The wind whispered through the scattered pines that gave the cemetery its name, carrying the scent of sage and dust. In the distance, a coyote called out, its lonesome cry echoing Katherine's grief. "The stone cracked when they were setting it," she explained, though she hadn't meant to speak at all. "Just like everything else in my life broken before it's even had a chance." Caleb studied the damaged marker. "Thomas Morgan, 1833–1878, a father, a friend, a fighter for justice," he read aloud. "Sounds like a man worth knowing." "He was the best man I've ever known," Katherine whispered. "Sheriff of this town for 15 years, never took a bribe, never backed down." Fresh tears welled in her eyes. "And they shot him in the back while he was buying candy for the schoolchildren." The cowboy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The Blackwell gang," Katherine's head snapped up. "How did you know?" "News travels." Caleb's eyes met hers directly. "I've been tracking them across 3 territories." "You're a lawman." Hope flickered briefly in Katherine's tear-stained face. "No, madam, just a man with a purpose." He didn't elaborate further, and Katherine didn't press. As darkness began to settle over the cemetery, Caleb rose to his feet in one fluid motion. "Miss Morgan, the night air isn't kind to the grieving. May I escort you back to town?" Katherine hesitated, looking back at the tombstone. Leaving felt like abandonment, yet she knew her father wouldn't want her catching her death in a graveyard. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Hollister, Caleb Hollister." He extended a hand to help her up, and Katherine noticed the gun calluses that spoke of a man familiar with violence, yet his touch was surprisingly gentle as he helped her to her feet. His horse, a magnificent chestnut gelding, stood patiently nearby. Caleb led the animal closer. "This is Patron. He doesn't mind carrying 2. Katherine had grown up around horses on her father's small ranch outside of town, but she still appreciated the cowboy's steady hand as he helped her mount. Once settled behind the saddle, she reluctantly placed her hands on Caleb's sides as he swung up in front of her. "Where to, Miss Morgan?" he asked as they left the cemetery behind, Morgan's Mercantile on Main Street. "I've been living above the store since." She didn't finish the sentence. The ride into Whispering Pines was short, but gave Katherine time to regain her composure. The town was quiet in the evening hours, with only the saloon showing much sign of life. A few townspeople nodded respectfully as they passed, their expressions sympathetic when they recognized the sheriff's daughter. Caleb brought Patron to a halt in front of a modest 2-story building with Morgan's Mercantile painted in faded letters across the front. A small, closed sign hung in the window. "This is me," Katherine said unnecessarily as he helped her down. Up close in the light spilling from nearby buildings, she could better see the man who had interrupted her grieving. He was tall and lean, with the kind of strength that came from work rather than show. His face bore the lines of a man who'd spent years under the sun, and a thin scar traced his jawline. But it was his eyes that caught her attention again. They held a depth of experience that seemed at odds with his apparent age of perhaps 30 years. "Thank you, Mr. Hollister," she said formally, "for your kindness at the cemetery." Caleb replaced his hat and nodded. "Just doing what any decent man would, Miss Morgan." "Katherine," she corrected, surprising herself. A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Katherine, then." He tipped his hat. "Good night." Katherine watched as he led Patron toward the livery stable down the street, his straight-backed figure gradually blending into the darkness. Only when he disappeared from view did she unlock the store's side door and climb the narrow staircase to her small apartment above. Inside, she lit a lamp and surveyed the sparse living space that had been her home since her father's passing. The mercantile had been her mother's dream before influenza took her 5 years ago. Katherine had kept it running while her father continued his duties as sheriff. Now both were gone, leaving her with a business she had no heart for and a future that stretched out empty before her. She moved to the window, watching the quiet street below. In the distance, she could see the saloon's lights and hear faint piano music. Her father had always said that civilization and wilderness existed side by side in frontier towns, like Whispering Pines, the saloon representing one, the church at the other end of town representing the other. Katherine wondered which side Caleb Hollister belonged to. There was something in his manner that spoke of civilization education, perhaps, but his eyes held the wildness of the frontier. And what had he meant about tracking the Blackwell gang? Was he a bounty hunter, a vengeful victim of their crimes, or something else entirely? As she prepared for bed, Katherine realized that for a brief time, the mysterious cowboy had distracted her from her grief. She wasn't sure whether to be grateful or guilty for the momentary reprieve. Morning came with the relentless brightness that seemed inappropriate to Katherine's mourning. She dressed mechanically in a simple black dress and pinned her hair in a practical bun before descending to open the store. The routine tasks of commerce might have seemed meaningless in the face of her loss, but the people of Whispering Pines depended on Morgan's mercantile for necessities. She had just finished arranging a display of canned goods when the bell above the door announced her first customer. Looking up, Katherine was startled to see Caleb Hollister standing in the doorway, hat in hand. "Good morning, Miss Morgan," he said with a slight bow of his head. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," she replied, smoothing her apron. "What can I help you with?" Caleb stepped further into the store, his spurs making a gentle jingling sound against the wooden floor. "I find myself in need of supplies." "Ammunition for a Winchester 73, some jerky, coffee if you have it." Katherine nodded and moved behind the counter. "We have all of those things. Will you be staying in Whispering Pines long?" "That depends," he said, examining a display of pocket knives. "I have business that might take some time to conclude." Katherine measured coffee beans into a small sack. "This business with the Blackwell gang," Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly. "You have a good memory." "When someone mentions the men who murdered my father, I tend to remember," she said with unexpected sharpness. He studied her for a moment. "Your father was a brave man, by all accounts. Taking on the Blackwells alone was." "Foolish," Katherine finished for him, her chin lifting defiantly. "I was going to say honorable," Caleb corrected gently, "but perhaps unwise. There are 4 of them, each worse than the last." Katherine placed the coffee on the counter with more force than necessary. "And what do you plan to do that my father couldn't?" "I don't plan to confront them directly, if that's what you're asking." He moved to the counter, placing his hat beside the coffee. "The Blackwells are cautious now. They know the law in every territory is looking for them, so I'm taking a different approach." Despite herself, Katherine was intrigued. "What approach is that?" Caleb leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. "Information. I've been tracking their associates, their habits, learning where they might go next." "And you think they might come here after what they did?" "No," he said, shaking his head, "but I think someone in Whispering Pines might know more than they've told the law about why the Blackwells were here in the first place." Katherine frowned. "What do you mean? They came to rob the bank, but my father interrupted them." Did they rob the bank? Caleb asked quietly. The question hit Katherine like a physical blow. No, they fled after shooting Pa, but everyone assumed. Exactly, the Blackwells don't leave money behind, Miss Morgan. They're vicious, but they're not careless. His blue eyes held her steadily. So why were they really in Whispering Pines? Katherine's mind raced. She had been so consumed by grief that she hadn't questioned the accepted narrative of her father's death. I don't know, she admitted. Neither do I, but I aim to find out. Caleb straightened up. How much do I owe you for the supplies? Katherine calculated the amount mechanically, her thoughts elsewhere. As she handed him his change, their fingers brushed briefly, and she felt a surprising jolt of awareness. Thank you, he said, gathering his purchases. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry about your father. From what I've heard, he was one of the few honest lawmen left in these parts. He was, Katherine confirmed, her voice softening. Would you let me know what you discover about why they were here? Caleb paused at the door, considering her request. It might not be information fit for a lady's ears. Katherine felt a flare of irritation. Mr. Hollister, I buried my father 3 days ago. I think we can dispense with concerns about my delicate sensibilities. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Fair enough. Perhaps we could discuss it over dinner this evening. The hotel has a decent dining room, I'm told. The invitation caught Katherine off guard. It wasn't proper for a recently bereaved woman to accept such an invitation, and yet. Yes, she heard herself say. I close the store at 6. I'll call for you at 6:30 then. With a tip of his hat, Caleb left the store, the bell jangling in his wake. Katherine stood motionless behind the counter, wondering what had possessed her to accept his invitation. Was it mere curiosity about her father's killers, or was there something about Caleb Hollister himself that drew her? Either way, she had committed herself now, and Katherine Morgan was not one to go back on her word. The rest of the day passed in a blur of transactions and polite condolences from townspeople. By closing time, Katherine was exhausted from maintaining her composure. She locked the store and hurried upstairs to prepare for dinner, telling herself that this was merely an information exchange, not a social occasion. Nevertheless, she found herself changing from her morning dress to a more flattering black skirt and blouse with subtle lace trim at the collar. She released her hair from its severe bun, brushing it until it fell in soft waves past her shoulders before pinning it back more loosely. A touch of her mother's rose water at her wrists and throat completed her preparations. When the knock came at the side door at precisely 6:30, Katherine was ready. She descended the stairs, lamp in hand, and opened the door to find Caleb standing there. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance as well. His clothes were clean, his hair damp from a recent wash, and he'd trimmed his beard to a neater line along his jaw. Miss Morgan, he said with a slight bow, you look lovely. Thank you, she replied, suddenly shy. And thank you for the invitation, though I'm afraid the gossips will have a field day. Caleb offered his arm. Let them talk. A business discussion between adults is hardly scandalous. The hotel dining room was moderately busy when they arrived. Several heads turned to watch them enter, and Katherine could almost hear the whispers beginning. The sheriff's daughter, barely in mourning, dining with a stranger. Once they were seated and had ordered, Caleb wasted no time in addressing the purpose of their meeting. I spent the day asking subtle questions around town, he said, keeping his voice low, and I've discovered something interesting. The day before your father was killed, he had a heated argument with Harold Simmons. Katherine frowned, the banker, but they were friends. At least I thought they were. Apparently not that day. According to the bartender at the saloon, your father accused Simmons of something that made the banker turn white as a sheet. They took their conversation outside, but several people noticed that they weren't on speaking terms afterward. That's strange, Katherine admitted. Pa never mentioned any disagreement. The next morning, the Blackwells arrived in town, and instead of heading straight for the bank, they were seen lurking near the sheriff's office. Caleb paused as their food arrived. Once the waiter had departed, he continued. I think your father knew something that made him dangerous to someone who might have connections to the Blackwells. Katherine set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. Are you suggesting that Harold Simmons hired those outlaws to kill my father? Caleb shook his head. I don't have enough information to make that claim, but I do think your father's death wasn't just a random act of violence by passing outlaws. The implications were staggering. If Caleb was right, then her father had been deliberately targeted, and if so, the person responsible was still in Whispering Pines, possibly someone they had known and trusted. What was Pa investigating before he died? She wondered aloud. That's what I need to find out, Caleb said. Did he keep any papers at home, notes about cases he was working on? Katherine thought for a moment. He had a small desk at our ranch. I haven't been out there since it happened. My father's deputy, Jim Porter, has been checking on the place and feeding the livestock. Would you be willing to go there tomorrow, to look through his things? The thought of returning to the ranch filled Katherine with dread. It had been her childhood home, a place of happiness and security. Now it would be empty, a constant reminder of her loss. I don't know if I can, she admitted, hating the weakness in her voice. Caleb's expression softened. I understand, but if there's anything there that might explain why your father was killed, wouldn't he want you to find it? Katherine knew he was right. Her father had been dedicated to justice his entire life. He would expect no less from his daughter. Yes, she said finally. We can go tomorrow morning. The store is always closed on Sundays. Thank you, Caleb said. Now, perhaps we should actually eat before our food goes cold. And maybe talk about something less grim. For the remainder of the meal, they spoke of lighter matters. Katherine learned that Caleb had grown up in Pennsylvania, the son of a schoolteacher who had instilled in him a love of books. He had come west after the war between the states, working as a cowhand, a stagecoach guard, and occasionally as a scout for the army. He spoke little of the war itself, though Katherine gathered he had fought for the Union. In turn, she told him about growing up in Whispering Pines, about her mother's dreams for the mercantile, and her own abandoned plans to attend a women's college back east. By the time they finished dessert, a surprisingly good apple pie, Katherine realized she had enjoyed her first genuine conversation since her father's death. As they walked back to the mercantile in the cool evening air, Caleb offered his arm again, and Katherine took it without hesitation. The contact was proper yet intimate, and she found herself acutely aware of his strength and warmth beside her. At her door, he released her arm and stepped back to a respectful distance. Thank you for a pleasant evening, Katherine. What time shall I call for you tomorrow? 9 o'clock. She suggested. The ranch is about an hour's ride from town. 9 it is. He tipped his hat. Good night. Good night, Caleb. The use of his first name felt natural now after the evening they had shared. As she prepared for bed that night, Katherine found herself thinking not just about the mystery surrounding her father's death, but also about the enigmatic cowboy who had inserted himself into her life. There was more to Caleb Hollister than he revealed, she was certain. His interest in the Blackwell gang seemed too personal for a mere concerned citizen. Yet she trusted him, perhaps more than was wise given how little she truly knew about him. With these thoughts swirling in her mind, Katherine finally drifted into the first peaceful sleep she'd had since her father's murder. Sunday morning dawned clear and warm. Katherine dressed in a practical riding skirt and blouse, braiding her hair to keep it contained during the ride. At precisely 9, Caleb arrived with 2 horses, his own patron, and a gentle-looking mare. I took the liberty of arranging a mount for you, he explained. The livery stable owner was happy to rent her out for the day. Thank you, Katherine said, approaching the mare and letting her sniff her hand. Hello, pretty girl, what's your name? Daisy, Caleb supplied. Supposedly the gentlest horse in the stable, Katherine smiled as she stroked the mare's velvety nose. She'll do nicely. The ride to the Morgan ranch took them through rolling grasslands dotted with mesquite and scrub oak. Along the way, Katherine pointed out landmarks: the creek where she had learned to swim, the ridge where wildflowers bloomed spectacularly each spring, the distant hills where her father had taught her to shoot a rifle. You know how to handle a firearm? Caleb asked, sounding impressed. Pa insisted, Katherine explained. Said a woman alone needs to be able to protect herself in this country. He was right, Caleb agreed, though I hope you've never had cause to use that knowledge, only against rattlesnakes and coyotes after the chickens. As they crested a small rise, the Morgan ranch came into view. It was a modest, spread a sturdy one-story house with a wide porch, a barn, a corral, and a few outbuildings. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney. Someone's there, Caleb observed, his hand moving subtly toward his sidearm. Probably Jim Porter, Katherine said. Pa's deputy, I mentioned he's been looking after the place. Sure enough, as they approached the house, Jim Porter emerged onto the porch, rifle in hand. He relaxed visibly when he recognized Katherine. Miss Katie, he called, using her childhood nickname. Wasn't expecting you today. Hello, Jim, she replied as they dismounted. This is Mr. Hollister. He's helping me with some matters regarding Pa's death. Jim Porter was a man of about 40 with a weathered face and kind eyes. He nodded cautiously at Caleb. Marshal, Ranger. Neither, Caleb replied, extending his hand. Just a concerned citizen with some relevant experience. Porter shook the offered hand but looked skeptical. Well, Miss Katie vouches for you. That's good enough for me. I was just making some coffee. You're welcome to join me. Inside, the house was clean but felt unlived in. Katherine's eyes were drawn to her father's empty chair by the fireplace, and she had to force herself to look away. While Jim poured coffee, Katherine explained their purpose. We need to look through Pa's papers. He may have been working on something important before he died. Jim frowned. The sheriff was always working on something. Man took his job serious, but I don't recall anything unusual in the weeks before. He trailed off, not wanting to mention the murder directly. Did you notice any tension between my father and Harold Simmons? Katherine asked. The deputy's expression changed subtly, a tightening around the eyes that was there and gone in an instant. Can't say as I did. Why? Caleb stepped in. Several people in town mentioned seeing them argue the day before Sheriff Morgan was killed. Town's full of gossips, Jim said dismissively. Thomas and Harold had their differences from time to time, like any men, but they were friends. Katherine sensed he was holding something back. Jim, if you know anything that might help us understand why Pa was killed, please tell me, the deputy sighed heavily. Look, Katie, your pa wouldn't want you involved in this. Whatever happened, it's a matter for the law now. The new sheriff arrives next week from Austin. Let him handle it. I can't wait that long, Katherine said firmly. The Blackwells could be hundreds of miles away by then, and if someone in town was involved, they'll have plenty of time to cover their tracks. Jim looked uncomfortable but didn't argue further. Your pa's desk is in the back room, same as always. I haven't touched anything in there. Katherine led Caleb to a small room that served as her father's home office. A roll-top desk stood against one wall, surrounded by bookshelves filled with law books, dime novels, and Katherine's old school books. He taught me to read at this desk, she said softly, running her fingers along its scarred wooden surface. Caleb squeezed her shoulder gently. Take your time. The desk was unlocked, which struck Katherine as unusual. Her father had always been careful with official documents. Inside, they found the expected assortment of papers, property deeds for the ranch, Katherine's mother's death certificate, tax receipts, and a half-written letter to the territorial governor about funding for a proper jail. Nothing unusual, Katherine murmured, disappointment evident in her voice. Caleb examined the desk more carefully. These roll-top desks often have hidden compartments, he said, running his fingers along the inner edges. A man like your father, cautious and methodical, might make use of such a feature. His fingers found a small irregularity in the wood at the back of the desk. Pressing it, they heard a faint click, and a narrow panel popped open, revealing a hidden space behind the normal compartments. Inside was a small leather journal and an envelope. Katherine reached for them with trembling hands. The envelope contained bank drafts, large ones, drawn on banks in San Francisco and Denver. The amounts were substantial, far more than a sheriff's salary could explain. What is this? Katherine whispered, shock evident in her voice. Caleb opened the journal and began to scan its pages. His expression grew increasingly grim as he read. Your father was investigating corruption, he said finally. It seems Harold Simmons and several other prominent citizens have been embezzling from the Territorial Development Fund for years. Catherine's mind reeled. That's impossible. These men are pillars of the community. According to your father's notes, they've been diverting money intended for schools, roads, and other improvements, using their positions of trust to enrich themselves. Caleb turned another page. And it gets worse. To cover their tracks, they've been laundering the money through businesses owned by the Blackwell family. The implications hit Katherine like a physical blow, so when Pa discovered the connection, they couldn't let him expose them, Caleb finished grimly. So they arranged to have him silenced permanently. A noise from the doorway made them both turn. Jim Porter stood there, his face ashen. I told Thomas to let it go, he said, his voice barely audible. Told him some things weren't worth dying over. Katherine stared at the deputy in horror. You knew they were planning to kill him? No, Jim protested, stepping into the room. I swear to God, Katie, I never thought it would come to that. I just knew he was digging into things that powerful men wanted kept buried. Did you know about the embezzlement? Caleb asked, his tone deceptively calm. Jim's shoulders slumped. Yes, not the full extent, but enough. Simmons approached me years ago, offered me a cut to look the other way on certain shipments coming through town. I was young, my wife was sick, I took the money. And when my father started investigating, Katherine demanded. I tried to warn him off without revealing my involvement, but Thomas was like a dog with a bone once he got the scent of wrongdoing. Jim ran a shaking hand through his hair. When I heard the Blackwells were coming to town, I never connected it. I swear, Katie, if I'd known what they were planning, I would have stopped it. Katherine wasn't sure she believed him, but one thing was certain: Jim Porter had betrayed her father's trust. Does the telegram operator work on Sundays? She asked Caleb. Probably not, he replied. Why? Because I want to send a message to the territorial marshal right away. These men need to be brought to justice. Jim's expression hardened. You can't do that, Katie. There's too much at stake. My father is dead because of these men, Katherine said, her voice rising. And you helped them, even if you didn't mean to. Don't tell me what I can't do. The deputy's hand moved to his gun. I'm sorry, but I can't let you leave with those papers. Caleb stepped smoothly between Katherine and the deputy. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Porter. Drawing on an unarmed woman isn't going to improve your situation. Stay out of this, Hollister. This doesn't concern you. I'm making it my concern. Caleb's voice remained calm, but Katherine could sense the danger coiled within him. There's still a chance for you to do the right thing. Help us bring these men to justice. For a moment, it seemed Jim might reconsider. Then his expression hardened, and he drew his pistol in one swift motion. Caleb moved faster than Katherine would have believed possible. Before Jim could aim, Caleb had closed the distance between them, knocking the deputy's arm upward. The gun discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as the two men grappled for control. Though younger and seemingly stronger, Jim was no match for Caleb's experience. Within moments, the deputy was disarmed, and on his knees, Caleb's gun pressed against his temple. Katherine, Caleb said without taking his eyes off Porter, there should be some rope in the barn. Would you mind fetching it? Still shaking from the sudden violence, Katherine nodded and hurried outside. In the barn, she found a coil of rope hanging on the wall. As she reached for it, she heard the sound of approaching horses, several of them, moving fast. Peering through the barn door, Katherine saw 3 riders approaching the house. Her blood ran cold as she recognized Harold Simmons in the lead, accompanied by 2 men she didn't know but whose hard faces marked them as gunmen rather than respectable citizens. She ran back to the house, bursting through the door. Riders coming, Harold Simmons and 2 others. Caleb had already tied Jim to a chair using his own belt. Take the evidence and get out through the back, he instructed, handing her the journal and bank drafts. Head for the creek and follow it north. There's a marshal's office in Crawford, about 20 miles from here. I'll find you there. What about you? Katherine protested. I'll delay them, make them think we're both still here. He checked his revolver. Go now, Katherine. Your father's legacy depends on you getting that evidence to the proper authorities. She knew he was right, but leaving him to face 3 armed men alone felt wrong. Caleb, Go, he repeated firmly. I've faced worse odds. With a final reluctant glance, Katherine slipped out the back door, clutching the precious evidence to her chest. She circled around to the barn, staying low and out of sight. Inside, she quickly saddled Daisy, her fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar buckles. As she led the mare out the back of the barn, she heard shouting from the house, followed by the sharp crack of gunfire. It took every ounce of willpower not to turn back, but Katherine forced herself to mount Daisy and ride toward the creek as Caleb had instructed. The mare was swift and sure-footed, carrying Katherine away from the ranch at a gallop. Only when they reached the shelter of the creek's tree-lined banks did she slow to a trot, allowing the animal to catch her breath. Katherine's mind raced as she rode. Had she just left Caleb to die? Was he even now lying bleeding on her father's floor, another victim of Harold Simmons' corruption? The thought was unbearable, yet she knew that reaching Crawford with the evidence was paramount. If she turned back now, everything her father had died for would be lost. The corrupt officials would destroy the evidence and likely kill her too. At least this way, there was a chance for justice. With grim determination, Katherine urged Daisy into a canter, following the creek northward toward Crawford and the hope of safety. The journey to Crawford was arduous. Katherine stayed off the main trails, following the creek as Caleb had advised. The summer heat was merciless, and by mid-afternoon, both she and Daisy were exhausted. They stopped in the shade of a cottonwood grove, where Katherine allowed the mare to drink and graze while she rested. Every sound a bird taking flight, the rustle of wind through leaves made her tense, expecting pursuit. She had her father's pocket watch with her and checked it periodically. 4 hours had passed since she'd fled the ranch. Crawford was still many miles away, and darkness would fall before she could reach it. As she prepared to mount again, Katherine heard the unmistakable sound of approaching hoofbeats. Her heart pounding, she led Daisy deeper into the trees, hoping they hadn't been spotted. She had no weapon except a small pocket knife, useless against armed men. The rider came into view around a bend in the creek, a single horseman on a chestnut gelding. Relief flooded through Katherine as she recognized Caleb and Patron. "Caleb," she called, leading Daisy back toward the creek. He turned at her voice, his face breaking into a rare smile. "Katherine, thank God you're safe." As he dismounted, she noticed he was favoring his left arm, and there was a bloodstain on his shirt sleeve. "You're hurt," she said, hurrying to him. "It's just a graze," he assured her, though his grimace as she examined the wound suggested otherwise. "I've had worse shaving." "What happened after I left?" Katherine asked, tearing a strip from her petticoat to bind his arm. "Simmons and his hired guns tried to take me by surprise." "They weren't expecting resistance." Caleb's expression darkened. "I managed to wound one of them and escape in the confusion. Unfortunately, Jim Porter wasn't so lucky." Katherine paused in her bandaging. "What do you mean?" Simmons shot him. Apparently, Porter knew too much and had become a liability. Caleb's eyes met hers. "I'm sorry, Katherine. I know he was your father's friend despite his mistakes." Katherine felt numb. Jim Porter had betrayed her father, had been complicit in the corruption that led to his death. Yet he had also been a presence throughout her childhood, a man who had taught her to fish and had attended her school recitals when her father was too busy. "We need to keep moving," Caleb said gently, seeing her distress. "Simmons and his men will be tracking us, and they know these lands better than I do." "Not better than me," Katherine said, her resolve hardening. "I grew up exploring every inch of this territory. There's an old trapper's cabin about 5 miles upstream. We can rest there tonight and continue to Crawford in the morning." Caleb nodded approvingly. "Lead the way." The trapper's cabin was little more than a one-room shack with a sagging roof, but it offered shelter and was well hidden among a stand of pine trees. Katherine had discovered it years ago during one of her solitary rides, and had occasionally used it as a refuge when storms caught her far from home. They settled the horses in a small clearing behind the cabin where they could graze, but wouldn't be visible from the creek. Inside, the cabin was dusty but intact, with a crude stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow cot. "We shouldn't risk a fire," Caleb said, checking the cabin's single window. The smoke would be visible for miles. Katherine nodded, unpacking the meager supplies she'd managed to grab before fleeing the ranch: a canteen of water, some jerky, and a handful of dried apples. "It's not much of a feast," she apologized. "It's a banquet compared to some meals I've had," Caleb replied with a wry smile. They ate in companionable silence as twilight deepened into night. With dinner finished, an awkward realization descended upon them. The cabin offered only one small cot, barely wide enough for one person, let alone two. "I'll sleep on the floor," Caleb said immediately, anticipating her concern. "With your injured arm, that hardly seems fair," Katherine hesitated. "We could share the cot if we're careful." Caleb looked at her thoughtfully. "Are you sure? Your reputation, my reputation, is the least of my concerns right now," she interrupted. "And I think we're both mature enough to handle the situation with propriety." In the end, they arranged themselves on the narrow cot with Katherine's back to Caleb's chest, a position that was intimate yet maintained a certain decorum. Katherine was intensely aware of his warmth behind her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and the protective weight of his arm draped carefully over her waist. "How did you get involved in all this?" she asked softly into the darkness. "Tracking the Blackwells, I mean, you never fully explained." Caleb was quiet for so long that she thought he might have fallen asleep. Finally, he spoke, his voice low near her ear. "My brother was a Pinkerton detective. 3 years ago, he was investigating the Blackwells for a series of train robberies. They discovered he was on their trail and ambushed him." His arm tightened slightly around her waist. "Colin was a good man, the best I've ever known. He left behind a wife and 2 small children." "I'm so sorry," Katherine whispered, understanding now the personal nature of his quest. "So you've been tracking them ever since?" "Yes. The Pinkertons wouldn't hire me, said I was too personally involved, so I've been doing it on my own, following leads, building a case that will put them away for good. When I heard about a sheriff being gunned down in Texas, I came to investigate. The Blackwells' involvement was too coincidental to ignore. And now we know it wasn't coincidental at all," Katherine said. "They were hired to kill my father because he discovered the embezzlement scheme. Your father was a brave man, Katherine. He could have looked the other way like Porter did, taken a share of the money. Instead, he chose to stand for what was right, no matter the cost." Tears welled in Katherine's eyes at his words. "Thank you for saying that, and thank you for helping me now. I'm not sure I could have done this alone." Caleb's hand found hers in the darkness, his calloused fingers entwining with her softer ones. "You're stronger than you know, Katherine Morgan. I have no doubt you would have found a way." The simple, sincere compliment warmed her more than any blanket could have. In that moment, lying in a ramshackle cabin with danger all around them, Katherine felt the first stirrings of something beyond gratitude toward Caleb Hollister, something that both frightened and exhilarated her. With that confusing realization swirling in her mind, she finally surrendered to exhaustion and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Dawn broke clear and cool, with mist rising from the creek. Katherine awoke to find herself alone on the cot, a rough blanket tucked carefully around her. For a moment, panic seized her. Had Caleb abandoned her? Had he been captured during the night? Then she heard movement outside and rose quickly to investigate. Through the cabin's small window, she saw Caleb by the creek, stripped to the waist as he bathed his wounded arm. Water droplets glistened on his sun-bronzed skin, highlighting the lean muscles of his back and shoulders. Various scars marked his body, telling silent stories of past dangers survived. Katherine knew she should look away, but something held her transfixed. This was a man forged by hardship and determination, a man who had suffered loss yet continued to fight for justice rather than surrendering to bitterness. As if sensing her gaze, Caleb turned toward the cabin. Katherine stepped back from the window hastily, her cheeks burning. She busied herself with repacking their meager supplies, trying to regain her composure before he returned. When Caleb entered the cabin a few minutes later, fully dressed with his hair still damp, Katherine kept her eyes on the task at hand. "Good morning," she said, her voice overly bright. "I was just getting ready to leave." "Morning," he replied, studying her with a slight furrow between his brows. Everything all right, of course, she said quickly. Just anxious to reach Crawford. It's still at least 4 hours' ride from here. Caleb nodded, apparently accepting her explanation. I checked the area. No sign of pursuit yet, but that doesn't mean they've given up. We should move quickly while we have the advantage. They set out as soon as the horses were saddled, following the creek for another mile before cutting eastward toward Crawford. The terrain became more rugged, with rocky outcroppings and steep ravines that slowed their progress but also provided cover from any potential pursuers. Around mid-morning, they crested a ridge that offered a view of the surrounding countryside. Caleb reined in Patron and scanned the horizon with narrowed eyes. "Riders," he said tersely, pointing to a dust cloud in the distance. 3, maybe 4, coming fast from the south. Catherine's heart sank. "Simmons? Likely. They must have picked up our trail somehow." Caleb turned to her, his expression grim. "Crawford is still at least 2 hours away at our current pace. We won't make it before they catch up." "What do we do?" Katherine asked, fighting to keep the fear from her voice. Caleb considered their options. "There's a box canyon about a mile east of here. I noticed it on my map earlier. One way in, high walls, it's defensible. If we can reach it before they spot us, we might be able to hold them off until help arrives." "Help? From where?" "I sent a telegram from the way station near your ranch before I followed you," Caleb explained, "to a ranger I know in Fort Worth. Asked him to meet us in Crawford with reinforcements. With any luck, when we don't arrive, he'll come looking." It was a slim hope, but better than none. "The canyon it is, then," Katherine agreed. They pushed their tired horses harder, galloping across the open ground before the pursuing riders could spot them. The entrance to the box canyon was narrow, barely wide enough for a single horse and partially concealed by scrub brush. Once inside, the space opened up to a sheltered area about 50 yards across, with a small spring bubbling from the base of the rock wall. "It's perfect," Katherine said, dismounting and leading Daisy to the spring. "Almost too perfect," Caleb replied, scanning the high walls surrounding them. Places like this were favorite ambush spots for Comanches. "Let's hope Simmons doesn't think to look for us here." They unsaddled the horses to let them rest and set up a makeshift camp near the back of the canyon. Caleb positioned himself near the entrance, rifle at the ready, while Katherine sorted through their supplies. "We have water but very little food," she reported, "and your bandage needs changing." Caleb allowed her to unwrap his wounded arm. The bullet graze looked angry and red, but there was no sign of serious infection. Katherine cleaned it with water from the spring and bound it with the last of her makeshift bandages. "Thank you," he said as she tied off the cloth. "You have a gentle touch." Their eyes met, and Katherine found herself unable to look away. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the connection that had formed so rapidly amid danger and shared purpose. The moment was broken by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Caleb was on his feet instantly, gesturing for Katherine to stay low and quiet. "They're coming," he whispered. "Stay back with the horses. If anything happens to me, take Patron and ride for Crawford. He's faster than Daisy and knows the command to run flat out. Just say lightning and hold on tight." "I'm not leaving you," Katherine protested. Caleb's expression softened momentarily. "Katherine, your father died to expose this corruption. Someone has to get that evidence to the authorities. Promise me you'll go if things go badly." Reluctantly, she nodded. "I promise, but things won't go badly. We'll face them together." The hoofbeats grew louder, then stopped. Voices could be heard outside the canyon, though the words were indistinct. Caleb positioned himself behind a boulder near the entrance, rifle aimed at the narrow opening. Minutes stretched like hours as they waited. Had the pursuers missed the canyon entrance? Or were they planning their approach? The answer came with a sudden shout from above. Katherine looked up to see a man standing on the rim of the canyon, rifle pointed down at them. Before Caleb could react, another voice called from the entrance. "Hollister, Morgan, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands up and maybe we'll let the girl live." Harold Simmons. Katherine would recognize the banker's pompous tone anywhere. Her father had always said Simmons reminded him of a bullfrog, puffed up with self-importance. Caleb didn't respond to the demand, instead signaling Katherine to move to a more sheltered position against the canyon wall. They were trapped, caught in the very defensive position that was supposed to protect them. "You have 30 seconds before we start shooting," Simmons called, "and our first target will be the horses. How far do you think you'll get on foot, Miss Morgan?" Katherine looked at the frightened animals, then at Caleb. His expression was calculating, eyes darting between the man on the rim and the narrow entrance. "I'm going to create a diversion," he said quietly. "When I do, you get on Patron and ride out as fast as you can. Don't stop for anything." "What about you?" she demanded. "I'll be right behind you on Daisy," he said, though something in his eyes told her he didn't believe it himself. Before she could argue further, Caleb pulled something from his saddlebag, a bundle of dynamite sticks with a short fuse. Katherine's eyes widened. "Where did you get that?" "Never travel in outlaw country without insurance," he replied with a grim smile. "Get ready to run for Patron. When I throw this, it's going to get very chaotic very quickly." Katherine positioned herself near the chestnut gelding, her heart pounding in her chest. Caleb struck a match against his boot and lit the fuse. With a powerful throw, he sent the dynamite sailing toward the rim of the canyon where the rifleman stood. The explosion was deafening in the confined space. Rock and debris rained down as part of the canyon wall collapsed. The horses reared in panic, and shouts of alarm came from their pursuers. "Now," Caleb yelled, pushing Katherine toward Patron. She scrambled onto the gelding's back, clutching the precious journal and bank drafts to her chest. Caleb slapped Patron's flank. "Lightning!" He shouted, and the horse bolted forward toward the canyon entrance. As they charged through the narrow opening, Katherine caught a glimpse of men scrambling for cover from the rockslide. A shot rang out, but it went wide as Patron thundered past. Behind her, she heard Caleb mounting Daisy and following. They burst out onto the open plain, Patron running full out with Katherine clinging to his mane. She risked a glance back and saw Caleb some distance behind on the slower mare, with 2 riders in pursuit. One of the pursuers raised a rifle and fired. Katherine watched in horror as Caleb jerked in the saddle, then slumped forward. He remained mounted, but even at a distance, she could tell he was badly hurt. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back to help him, but she remembered his words and her promise. The evidence had to reach Crawford. With tears streaming down her face, Katherine faced forward and urged Patron to even greater speed. The ride to Crawford was a blur of grief and determination. Patron seemed to understand the urgency, maintaining a pace that gradually left the pursuers behind. By the time the small town came into view, the chestnut gelding was lathered with sweat and breathing heavily. Katherine rode directly to the marshal's office, drawing stares from townspeople as she dismounted and stumbled through the door. Inside, she found not only the local lawman, but also a stern-faced man wearing the distinctive star of a Texas Ranger. "Are you Katherine Morgan?" the ranger asked, stepping forward. "Yes," she gasped, holding out the journal and bank drafts with shaking hands. "My father was Sheriff Thomas Morgan. He was murdered for discovering this evidence of corruption, and Caleb Hollister may be dead too, trying to help me deliver it." The ranger took the evidence, his expression grim. "Where is Hollister now?" "About an hour's ride west," Katherine said, fighting back tears. "He was shot. 2 men were chasing him." The ranger turned to the local marshal. "Get a posse together, now." To Katherine, he added, "I'm Ranger Sam Hartley. Caleb sent for me. That stubborn fool has been hunting the Blackwells for years without official sanction. Looks like he finally found something concrete. Please," Katherine begged, "we have to help him." "We will, Miss Morgan. But first, let's get you somewhere safe." "No, I'm going with you. I know the terrain better than anyone." The ranger studied her for a moment, then nodded curtly. "Very well, but you'll stay back when we find them. I won't have another civilian casualty on my hands." Within 30 minutes, a posse of 8 men was assembled, Katherine among them on a fresh horse borrowed from the livery. They rode hard back the way she had come, following Patron's tracks. About halfway to the canyon, they heard gunfire. Ranger Hartley signaled for the posse to spread out and approach with caution. As they crested a small rise, Katherine saw a scene that made her blood run cold. Caleb was pinned down behind a large boulder, exchanging shots with Harold Simmons and his remaining gunmen. Daisy lay dead nearby, and Caleb's movements suggested he was indeed wounded, possibly seriously. "Circle around to the left," Hartley ordered most of the posse. "Miss Morgan, stay here with Deputy Collins." He pointed to a young lawman who looked barely out of his teens. But as the posse moved into position, Simmons spotted them. With a shout to his companion, the banker made a desperate break for his horse. The gunman provided covering fire, forcing the lawman to take cover. Katherine watched in dismay as Simmons mounted and began to ride away. Without thinking, she urged her horse forward, ignoring Deputy Collins's shout of protest. She had grown up racing horses across this very countryside and knew she could catch the fleeing banker. As she galloped past the boulder where Caleb was sheltered, their eyes met briefly. Despite his obvious pain, he managed a small smile that gave her courage. Simmons was a poor rider, his seat awkward and his control of his mount limited. Katherine gained ground rapidly, determination fueling her pursuit. When she drew alongside him, she did something her father had taught her years ago, reached out and grabbed the reins near the horse's bit, yanking hard. The startled animal reared, throwing Simmons heavily to the ground. Katherine dismounted quickly, standing over the dazed banker with cold fury in her eyes. "This is for my father," she said, her voice steady. Before Simmons could respond, the ranger and his posse arrived, taking the banker into custody. Katherine didn't wait to see him restrained. She was already running back toward Caleb. She found him still behind the boulder, his face pale with blood loss. A bullet had struck his side, and though he had managed to bind it with a strip of his shirt, the makeshift bandage was soaked through. "Katherine," he said weakly as she knelt beside him, "you came back." "Of course I came back," she replied, tears finally spilling over. "I brought help. You're going to be all right." His hand found hers, squeezing with surprising strength. "The evidence safe with the rangers." "Simmons is in custody." She brushed the hair from his forehead gently. "You did it, Caleb, we did it. My father's killers will face justice." A ghost of his wry smile touched his lips. "And the Blackwells?" "One step at a time," she said firmly. "First, we need to get you to a doctor." The ranger approached, assessing Caleb's condition with a practiced eye. "We need to get him to Crawford right away. That wound needs proper attention." With careful movements, they helped Caleb onto a horse, Katherine mounting behind him to keep him steady. As they began the slow journey back to town, Caleb leaned back against her, his voice barely audible. "Thank you for coming back for me." Katherine tightened her arms around him, mindful of his wound. "Always," she whispered, a promise meant for his ears alone. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and hope. Caleb's wound proved serious but not fatal, thanks to the skilled hands of Crawford's doctor. While he recovered in a room above the town's small hotel, Katherine rarely left his side, reading to him from dime novels or simply sitting in companionable silence. Ranger Hartley remained in Crawford, coordinating with territorial authorities as the corruption case expanded. Harold Simmons had begun talking in the hope of leniency, revealing a network of embezzlement that stretched to the territorial capital. Arrest warrants were issued for a dozen prominent citizens, including 2 of the men who had accompanied Simmons to the Morgan ranch. Of the Blackwells themselves, there was no immediate sign, but Hartley assured Katherine and Caleb that with the evidence they had provided, it was only a matter of time before the notorious outlaws were brought to justice. On the 5th day of Caleb's recovery, Katherine returned to his room after a brief visit to the telegraph office. She found him sitting up in bed, looking stronger than he had since the shooting. "The doctor says you're healing well," she said, taking her usual seat beside his bed. "Well enough to travel soon," Caleb replied, watching her closely. "The ranger says they've traced the Blackwells to New Mexico territory. Once I'm on my feet, I intend to join the pursuit." Katherine's heart sank at his words, though she had been expecting them. Caleb Hollister was not a man to leave a task unfinished, especially one as personal as bringing his brother's killers to justice. "I understand," she said softly, looking down at her hands. "Do you?" Caleb reached out, tilting her chin up gently to meet his gaze. Because I'm not sure I do. A week ago, my life had a single purpose: find the Blackwells and see them pay for what they did to Colin. Now, Katherine prompted when he fell silent. Now I find myself thinking about what comes after, about whether there can be a life beyond vengeance. His blue eyes held her steadily. About you, Katherine, her breath caught in her throat. What about me? I think you know. His hand moved to cup her cheek. In the middle of all this danger and darkness, I found something I wasn't looking for, something I thought I'd never find again after losing Colin and everything familiar. Katherine leaned into his touch, her heart racing. And what was that, Hope? He said simply. A reason to think about tomorrow rather than dwelling on yesterday. You gave me that, Katherine Morgan. Tears pricked at her eyes. You gave me the same gift, Caleb. After Pa died, I couldn't see any future for myself, just endless days of grief and running a store I never wanted. And now, what do you see now? The question hung between them, weighted with possibility. Katherine took a deep breath, finding courage she hadn't known she possessed. I see a chance to start again, to honor my father by living the kind of brave, principled life he would have wanted for me. She met his gaze directly. And I see you if you want to be seen. A slow smile spread across Caleb's face, transforming his usually serious features. I want that very much, he said, drawing her closer. But there's still the matter of the Blackwells. I made a promise to Colin's widow and children. I would never ask you to break that promise, Katherine assured him. We finish what we started together, and then we begin what comes next together, Caleb completed, his lips finding hers in a gentle, questioning kiss that quickly deepened into something more certain. When they finally parted, both breathless, Katherine couldn't help but laugh softly. My father would be scandalized. Kissing a man I've known barely a week, in his sick room no less. From what you've told me about Thomas Morgan, I think he'd be more concerned with my intentions, Caleb replied, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. Which, I should clarify, are entirely honorable. I should hope so, Mr. Hollister, she teased, though her heart soared at his words. Their newfound happiness was interrupted by a knock at the door. Ranger Hartley entered, his expression serious but not grim. Sorry to intrude, he said, tipping his hat to Katherine. Just received a telegraph from Santa Fe. They've apprehended 2 of the Blackwell brothers, Ezra and Daniel. The other 2 are still at large, but it's a start. Caleb straightened, wincing slightly at the movement. When do we leave? We don't, Hartley corrected firmly. I leave tomorrow. You're staying put until that wound heals properly. That's an order, Hollister. I'm not under your command, Sam, Caleb reminded him. No, but you are under mine, Katherine interjected, her tone brooking no argument. And I say you're not getting on a horse until the doctor gives his approval. The ranger grinned at Caleb's frustrated expression. I'd listen to her if I were you. Women like that are rarer than honest politicians. With a tip of his hat, he left them alone again. He's right, you know, Caleb said once the door closed, about you being rare. I've never met anyone quite like you, Katherine Morgan. Is that a compliment, Mr. Hollister? The highest I can give. His expression grew more serious. I want you to know that whatever happens with the Blackwells, my feelings for you won't change, but I need to see this through to the end. Katherine nodded. I understand, and when it's over, what then? Will you go back to Pennsylvania? Caleb considered the question. There's nothing for me there anymore. My parents are gone, and Colin's family moved to Chicago after his death. He took her hand, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. I was thinking I might try my hand at ranching. I hear there's good land available near Whispering Pines. Joy bloomed in Katherine's chest at his words. The best land in Texas, she agreed. And I happen to know of a small ranch that needs a new owner. The previous one left it to his daughter, but she's more interested in running a mercantile in town with her. Husband, the word hung between them, a question and an offer all at once. Caleb brought her hand to his lips. Is that so? Well, I'd have to discuss terms with this daughter, see if we could reach an arrangement that satisfies us both. I think that could be arranged, Katherine said softly, leaning in to seal their understanding with another kiss. 2 months later, Katherine stood in the doorway of Morgan's mercantile, watching as Caleb loaded supplies into their wagon. His wound had healed well, leaving only another scar to join the collection on his body. They had been married for 3 weeks, in a simple ceremony attended by the townsfolk of Whispering Pines, who had rallied around Katherine after learning the truth about her father's murder. Harold Simmons and his conspirators were awaiting trial in Austin, their case strengthened by testimony from Jim Porter's widow, who had found additional evidence in her late husband's possession. Of the Blackwell brothers, 3 had now been captured, with only the youngest, Matthew, still at large. Caleb had made peace with the fact that his quest for vengeance had transformed into something else, a pursuit of justice that honored his brother's memory without consuming his own future. With the majority of the gang behind bars and posing no further threat to innocent people, he had turned his attention to building a life with Katherine. They had decided to split their time between the ranch and the mercantile, hiring help for both so they could manage the dual responsibilities. Today marked their first trip back to the Morgan ranch since their wedding, a homecoming that Katherine both anticipated and dreaded. "Ready?" Caleb asked, offering his hand as she approached the wagon. "As I'll ever be," she replied, allowing him to help her up to the seat. The ride to the ranch was filled with memories for Katherine of childhood adventures, of her parents' laughter, of the grief that had nearly overwhelmed her at her father's death. But now, with Caleb beside her, those memories were tinged with hope rather than sorrow. As they crested the final rise and the ranch came into view, Katherine gasped softly. The house had been repainted, the fence mended, and the garden replanted. Fresh curtains hung in the windows and smoke curled invitingly from the chimney. "Surprise," Caleb said, watching her reaction with barely concealed delight. "I had some help from the neighbors while you were busy with wedding preparations." Tears welled in Katherine's eyes. "It looks like it did when I was a girl," she whispered, "before Ma got sick." "I wanted it to be perfect for you," Caleb explained as they drew closer. "For us." As they pulled up to the house, the door opened and an older woman emerged, wiping her hands on an apron. "Mrs. Abernathy," Katherine said in surprise, recognizing her mother's old friend from town. "Welcome home, you two," the woman called cheerfully. "I've got stew on the stove and fresh bread in the oven. Thought you might appreciate a hot meal after your journey." Katherine turned to Caleb questioningly. He shrugged, a smile playing at his lips. "I may have arranged for a few comforts to ease our transition. Mrs. Abernathy has agreed to help around the house until we're properly settled." "You think of everything," Katherine said, reaching up to touch his cheek tenderly. "I try," he replied, covering her hand with his own. "I want to build something good here, Katherine, something that would make your father proud." "He would be proud," she assured him, "of both of us." After helping Mrs. Abernathy serve the meal, Caleb excused himself to check on the livestock, leaving the women to catch up. When he returned an hour later, the kitchen was filled with the scent of apple pie and the sound of Katherine's laughter as Mrs. Abernathy regaled her with stories of her parents' courtship. That evening, after their helper had departed for her own home in town, Katherine and Caleb sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against him in comfortable silence. "I never thought I'd find peace here again," Katherine said finally, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. "After Pa died, this place felt haunted by everything I'd lost." "And now," Caleb asked, his fingers gently stroking her arm, "now it feels like home again." She turned to look up at him. "Because of you," Caleb's eyes reflected the starlight as he gazed down at her. "I felt the same way after Colin died, like I'd never find peace again, but you changed that, Katherine. You showed me there's more to life than vengeance." "We healed each other," she said simply. "And we'll keep doing so every day." He leaned down to kiss her, a promise sealed beneath the Texas stars. In the cemetery at Whispering Pines, Thomas Morgan's tombstone had been repaired, the crack filled and polished until it was barely visible. Katherine visited weekly, placing fresh flowers and updating her father on the changes in her life. Sometimes she went alone, sometimes with Caleb, but she no longer went to grieve. Instead, she went to remember and to give thanks for the justice that had been served. And if sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, Caleb woke from nightmares of his brother's death. Katherine was there to hold him until the shadows receded. Just as he was there for her when memories of her father's murder grew too painful to bear alone. They had both known loss, had both stood at broken graves and felt the weight of grief threatening to crush them. But they had found each other in that darkness, two wounded souls recognizing in each other the strength to heal and the courage to begin again. 1 year to the day after Katherine had been found crying beside a cracked tombstone, she and Caleb returned to the cemetery. This time, she carried a small bundle in her arms, their infant son, Thomas Colin Hollister, named for the two brave men whose legacies had brought his parents together. As the family stood before the now-mended stone, Caleb removed his hat and held it against his chest, just as he had that first day. But this time, the silence between them was not filled with grief, but with gratitude for the unexpected gift they had found amid their shared sorrow, a love strong enough to mend what had been broken, and to build something new and beautiful from the fragments of their past.